My book is called The Emperor of All Maladies. And is this working? And it's a history of cancer. And the first question that people ask me is why I wrote the book. And I was an oncologist. I am an oncologist. I treat cancer patients, and I spend most of my life as a researcher. I'm a stem cell scientist. And then I was in training in cancer medicine in Boston when a patient of mine who had an aggressive variant of abdominal cancer, and she had responded and relapsed and responded and relapsed. And then at one point of time, she stopped and she said, Sid, I'm willing to go on with trials and drugs and therapies, but before I do that, I need to know what it is that I'm fighting. And it was a very humbling and a moving moment for me because I realized that not only could I not answer that question, as an oncologist, I couldn't point her to a single book or a resource that would answer the question in the fullest sense possible. What was it that she was fighting? How old was it? Since when has it begun to envelop our lives in the way it does today? Where are we going? What happens next? And how did we get here? How did we get in this moment of time with cancer being what it is? And just so that no one thinks for a second that this is an abstruse problem, I'd just like to point out some numbers. I mean, I won't go through all these figures, but just to let you know that there is no doubt statistically that cancer will envelop each and every one of our lives. And if you go to Amazon.com or something, you will find 5,000 books about cancer. And for the most part, they're of the variety, eat celery and eat carrots and you'll cure colon cancer. And I began to find these books somewhat insulting, actually. So I wrote this book really to answer the question, and as I said, to fill up a vacuum that existed in this history, in the history of cancer. There's a famous saying by Hillary, who climbed Everest. And when he was asked, well, why did you climb Everest? And he said, as you very famously know, because it was there. And so this book doesn't have any pretensions of being the climb of Mount Everest. But really, I wrote this book because it was not there. And the fact that it was not there made it impossible for me not to write the book. The book was driven by that urgency, the urgency that Andrew and others have felt when cancer envelops our lives. So I can't summarize the entire book. It's a 600-page book. I hope you read it. But I'll tell you a little story about the book, and through that story, perhaps a story about how the book was written. And in the end, I want to spend a few minutes maybe reading a single page from the book just to give you a sense of how such a book is ever written. So my story begins with the main character in this book, Sidney Farber. Some of you might have been to Boston, went to the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and wondered who Dana-Farber was. There is no Dana-Farber. It was Charles Dana and Sidney Farber, two separate individuals. Sidney Farber was a pathologist, and he had a tiny basement laboratory at the bottom of Children's Hospital, a freezing, about 20-foot by 14-foot space, full of the smell of formalin. I've been inside that space. It's virtually unlivable. And he was a pathologist, so he essentially only saw the bodies of children. Children would be wheeled down after they were dead into this freezing basement, and then he would perform autopsies. But then Sidney Farber had a hunger, and it was that hunger actually which drew me to him when I first started this book. He began to have this hunger about treating patients. And remember, this is 1947, and acute leukemia in children, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, was not just a virtually incurable form of cancer, it was a lethal form of cancer in its speed. Children would be diagnosed on Monday and would be dead by Friday, and 2, 4, 6-year-old children. And Farber became very interested in acute lymphoblastic leukemia for a single reason, and that was that of all the very many forms of cancer, it had one advantage, and that was that it could be measured. And science always begins with measurement. And because you could draw blood from a child, you could figure out, this is the age before CAT scans, this is before MRIs, so you can't quantify the growth or the death of an internal tumor. but you can quantify the growth and death of a blood tumor because you can draw a drop of blood and you can look at it as a pathologist would under a microscope. So Farber became obsessed with lymphoblastic leukemia. And he had a very important clue. And that clue came from a very interesting lady, Lucy Wills, a little bit forgotten in history, an English hematologist who became interested in finding out the cause of various forms of anemia. Interesting lady, eccentric. She went to India to investigate a particular form of anemia which no one had seen before or no one had really understood before. And this anemia was predominantly present in pregnant women who were malnourished. So she was very interested in why pregnant women who were malnourished, they lived in the factory workers had this very peculiar form of anemia. And here, this is a little note from her. Again, you see her writing anemia, pregnancy. And then she made a very important discovery. She saw that if you fed these women Marmite? Yes. If you fed these women Marmite, the anemia would recover. So she became interested in this idea that Marmite must have some hidden substance which was responsible for the recovery of the anemia. And she didn't eventually figure it out, but very soon chemists had broken Marmite down into its various components. And of course, that substance turned out to be folic acid, folate. So Wills essentially figured out that deficiencies of folic acid, which is a vitamin, can block the growth of normal blood. And Farber, who knew of Wills' work, began to wonder, could an anti-folic acid drug block the growth of a blood cancer? And so Farber had a friend, another interesting character who we talk about in the book. He was an Indian chemist, lived alone in Boston, who had begun to manufacture the series of antifolates. A series of accidents had allowed him to manufacture these antifolates, and he began to administer 2-, 4-, and 6-year-old kids with acute lymphoblastic leukemia with antifolates, these antifolates that Yella Subbarao was the name of the chemist, had made. Now I'm going to tell you a story about how a book like this is written, because it's the story about the discovery of the first patient who got these antifolates. I became obsessed with finding the first child who got antifolates and had a remission, because every time I would feel the pulse of this book, it's 600 pages, every time I'd feel the pulse of this book begin to drop, my instinct was always to find the patient. Find the patients, and their stories will finish the story of the book for you. So I began to be obsessed with finding the patient who had, and I knew only the following piece of information. I knew that his name was R.S., and that he was 2.5 years old, lived in Boston, and nothing else, in 1948, and had died after 1 to 3 months of a remission. So I began to post on various listservs. I knew he had a twin. If you had a twin with leukemia in 1948, please write to me. I began to post in various settings. Nothing. Months, nothing. So I got very disheartened, and I said, I took a vacation. I went back to India, to my parents' house, and someone said to me, the chemist who had synthesized the folates, Yella Subbarao, had a single biographer. The biographer lives about 4 blocks from my house in Delhi. So I said, why not? I'll go meet the biographer. So I walk over 4 blocks from Delhi, 1,000 miles away from Boston. And the biographer tells me, in 1950, I went to the Sidney Farber Cancer Hospital, and I have a roster of all the patients who were treated with leukemia. So here I was, as I said, 1,000 miles away, and I said, can I see that roster? And there it was, Robert Sandler. And he said, there was an article about Robert Sandler in the Boston Sunday Herald of 1948. And I said, show me the article. And he said, well, you have to go find it. So I ran back. Actually, I really flew back to Boston, but I could have run back to Boston. And I went to the library, which became my haven while I was writing this book. And I found in a few minutes that I was staring at Robert Sandler's face. And there's Robert Sandler. And using his name, I could then go back to the directory of the Boston directory and find the name of his parents. And because I knew that the child was the child of a ship worker, and in about 20 minutes from now, I was back where I had started, but I was in the house of Robert Sandler. So I'm just telling you that story because that story became metaphorical for me about how a book like this is written. Farber was a scientist, as I said. He was in the laboratory, but then he made a very critical ally, and that was Mary Lasker. Here's Mary Lasker. She's a legendary socialite, a person who could have had so many connections that she basically knew everyone in this room by their first name. She was glamorous, she was independent, she was an entrepreneur, very unusual for her time, independently wealthy because she had started her own entrepreneurial ventures. And this is Mary Lasker, and you might think for a second that she's being photographed at the Museum of Modern Art, but make no mistake, that Monet probably belongs to her. So there she is, Mary Lasker. Mary Lasker and Farber teamed up, and she and Farber began to put pressure on the nation, particularly on Nixon. And this advertisement appeared in 1969, and this really marks the beginning of the war on cancer. And so, Mr. Nixon, you can cure cancer, and there's a subtext there which says, wouldn't it be very nice to cure cancer by America's 200th birthday? So that birthday, as you know, has gone and passed. And where are we today? Now, before we go on, let me spend 1 second reminding you that this is the 1950s and 1960s. America is about to land a man on the moon. The Manhattan Project, which is a long inheritance, has been phenomenally successful. So imagine the hubris of this moment. Here are Farber and Mary Lasker, who want to cure cancer by America's 200th birthday. And as someone said it to me, that is almost like landing a rocket on the moon without knowing Newton's laws. But there they were, and we have to be thankful to them for it. What happens next is that there was an enormous expansion in the budget of the National Cancer Institute. And we see this rising up from the 1970 onward. That arrow marks the moment that the war on cancer was launched. And the question you might ask yourself is, well, what happened? And the answer is, for a long time, not very much happened. This next slide shows the cancer-related deaths divided in various age ranges between 1955 and 2004. And the first thing that you see is that between 1970-odd to 1980, give or take a few years, the death rate was static for most age groups, and if anything, the death rate was rising. But then things started turning around, and in the last part of the book, I talk about what happens next. And one of the things that's happened next is visible in this slide. So this is a slide that plots the total cancer mortality in the US over several decades, bringing us actually right up to 2006 in this case, divided into men and women. And first thing you notice, of course, is the cancer deaths are rising. This is largely because of the aging population overall and because the population is increasing. So this is a natural rise. But what's very gratifying, of course, is that you find that about 1990s, 2000s, you see this plateauing effect. Now, importantly, that plateauing effect hasn't turned around. And one of the great challenges of our generation is to turn that plateau of cancer around. Now, how are we going to do this? I don't know, but there has been an explosion in the understanding of the cancer cell. So if you return back to my original analogy now, we finally know Newton's laws. Now, that doesn't mean that we can land a rocket on the moon, but the knowledge of even the glimpse of Newton's laws makes a huge difference. This is a slide that I borrowed from Bert Vogelstein, a very important cancer researcher, which talks about the mutations in the cancer genome. This is called the landscape of the cancer genome. I'd like us to get very familiar with this landscape because this is going to haunt us in our lives. So here's a way that Vogelstein depicts it. He's basically put every gene on the sheet of paper, and he's marked out, for a given individual cancer, he's marked out every mutation in a white dot. And in these peaks, and the red peaks and mountains, are those white dots across 100 or 200-odd samples from the same cancer. And what we learned from this slide, we learned something very important. Number one, we learned that there is an overlap for a single cancer between one dot and the peak, which means that in a single cancer, in a single colorectal cancer, there is an overlap between its mutation and the most common mutations across 100 samples. But we also learned something very troubling, and that is if you look, there are many white dots that do not correspond to peaks. And that means every single colorectal cancer, this is not even, I'm not talking across different cancers, every single colorectal cancer, therefore, contains a heterogeneity of mutations. And again, I point this out using some examples right here. So should we be dejected and stop? No, because it turns out that some mutations in cancers are more important than others. And some mutations, if you target them with the appropriate kind of drug, you can get an amazing clinical response. And again, I was obsessed in this book at finding the first patients. And so here is Barbara Bradfield. She actually sent me this picture. Barbara Bradfield is the longest survivor of Herceptin treatment. She is an iconic patient. She's someone that history will remember because she gave up her time and potentially her life to enroll in the first trial of Herceptin. She's still alive today. She had metastatic breast cancer. So in conclusion, what does this book tell us? This book tells us that we are in this battle for a very long time, but an enormous amount of resources are going to be deployed in order to battle this very elemental and magisterial illness. So I'm going to now turn and just read you the very last page of my book. And again, as a reminder of what lies ahead, perhaps. This is the story of Germaine. I've changed the names and dates of the patients in this book to protect privacy, but this is the story of Germaine, a woman who had relapsed many, many times with abdominal cancer, had an incredible response to a particular drug, and had stretched out a response for about 6.5 years, and then finally relapsed again. When I recall that final conversation with Germaine, embarrassingly enough, the object seemed to stand out more vividly than the words. A hospital room with its sharp smell of disinfectant and hand soap, the steely, unflattering overhead light, a wooden side table on wheels piled with pills, books, newspaper clippings, nail polish, jewelry, postcards. Her room wallpapered with pictures of her beautiful house in Montgomery and of her daughter holding some fruit picked from her garden, a standard issue plastic hospital pitcher filled with a bunch of sunflowers perched on a table by their side. Germaine, as I remember her, was sitting by the bed, one leg dangling casually down, wearing her usual eccentric and arresting combination of clothes and some large and unusual pieces of jewelry. Her hair was carefully arranged. She looked formal, frozen, and perfect, like a photograph of someone in the hospital waiting to die. She seemed content. She laughed. She joked. She made wearing a nasogastric tube seem effortless and somehow dignified. Only years later, in writing this book, could I finally put into words why that meeting left me so uneasy and humbled, why the gestures in that room seemed larger than life, why the object seemed like symbols, why Germaine herself seemed like an actor playing a part. Nothing, I realized, was incidental. The characteristics of Germaine's personality that had once seemed spontaneous and impulsive were, in fact, calculated and almost reflexive responses to her illness. Her clothes were loose and vivid because they were decoys against the growing outline of the tumor in her abdomen. Her necklace was distractingly large so as to pull attention away from her cancer. Her room was topsy-turvy with baubles and pictures, the hospital pitcher filled with flowers, the cards tacked to the wall, because without them, it would devolve into the cold anonymity of any other room in any other hospital. She had dangled her leg at that precise posed angle because the tumor had invaded her spine and begun to paralyze her other leg, making it impossible to sit any other way. Her casualness was studied. The jokes were rehearsed. Her illness had tried to humiliate her. It had made her anonymous and seemingly humorless. It had sentenced her to die an unsightly death in a freezing hospital room thousands of miles away from home. But she had responded with vengeance, moving always to be one step ahead, trying to outwit it. It was like watching someone locked in a chess game. Every time Germaine's disease moved, imposing yet another terrifying constraint on her, she made an equally assertive move in return. The illness acted, she reacted. It was a morbid, hypnotic game, a game that had taken over her life. She dodged one blow, only to be caught by the other. She, too, was like Carol's Red Queen, stuck pedaling furiously just to keep in the same place. Germaine seemed that evening to have captured something essential about our struggle against cancer. That to keep pace with this malady, you need to keep inventing and reinventing, learning and unlearning strategies. Germaine fought cancer obsessively, cannily, desperately, fiercely, madly, brilliantly, and zealously. as if channeling all the fierce inventive energy of generations of men and women who had fought cancer in the past and would fight it in the future. Her quest for a cure had taken her on a strange and limitless journey through internet blogs and teaching hospitals and chemotherapy and clinical trials halfway across the country, through a landscape more desolate, desperate, and disquieting than she had imagined. She had deployed every last morsel of her energy to the quest, mobilizing and remobilizing the last dregs of her courage, summoning her will and wit and imagination until that final evening she had stared into the vault of her resourcefulness and found it empty. In that haunted last night, hanging on to her life by no more than a tenuous thread, summoning all her strength and dignity as she wheeled herself to the privacy of her bathroom, it was as if she had encapsulated the essence of a 4,000-year-old war. Thank you.